Welcome back to the Builder's Bench, where politics meets construction. A quick recap for you. The government's in gear. Prime Minister Carney's rolled out a slimmer cabinet. The King delivered the throne speech. And in somewhat of a twist, just one mandate letter was issued for Carney's cabinet. So what does this wave of federal action mean for Canada's builders? And we will touch on Bill C5, which is some are calling the most talked about bill we've seen in years. So joining me on the bench today, Louis-Philippe Champagne, Associate Vice President, Public Affairs and Industry Practices at the Canadian Construction Association, and regular Sajjid Lakhani, Director at Impact Public Affairs. How you both doing?
Pretty good.
Happy to be here.
Very busy past few weeks for both of you. Lots to talk about. So let's just dive right into it. I wanted to start with the cabinet reset. Carney's new cabinet structure includes 28 ministers and 10 secretaries of state. So would you say a leaner cabinet is better for builders?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, 2 cabinets in 2.5 months. I think the signal that Mark Carney sent with his caretaker cabinet in early spring was a very good one. We're going to go with something very small, very efficient, very business oriented. But of course, this was a pure caretaker cabinet. The best example of that, in my opinion, is Steve McKinnon being the sole responsible for ESDC at the time, which was a portfolio of 5 ministers. So an impossible workload in general term. But for the election, that was what they needed. And that turns out to be pretty efficient in guiding Canada through the craziness of what was happening in the US in March and April and May. And leading us to this new cabinet announcement that we now have. A much bigger cabinet, to be fair, than a caretaker, as expected, but leaner than we've seen in the past. And I think this is, again, a very positive message to send to Canadian that we can be efficient with our federal spending. A few key takeaways. Having a nice diversified cabinet was a positive thing that we've seen, which can be difficult if you try to make it fairly narrow. But personally, what I like is the balance between the long-term Trudeau minister coming back, which I was concerned you would do a copy-paste of Trudeau's cabinet. That would have been a strong message to send that, it's the same old again. That didn't happen. A lot of new faces. Some of them new MPs, some of them have been MP in the past, but never to cabinet. So this is a strong message to send, I think, to Canadian that he's not Justin Trudeau. It's a new government. It's a new way of doing business. And as you mentioned, everything that followed after that, press conference, mandate, single mandate letter, all of that goes into that trend of hammering this. Personally, I'm quite happy to see some of the big figure we now have in cabinet, especially for the construction sector. Happy to let you guys jump in and share some of your personal thought. But I think in terms of infrastructure, in terms of immigration, in terms of U.S.-Canada relation, we have a lot of good names there that we can look into details.
Sajjid, thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with most of LP's sentiments. It's going to be interesting for some of the ministers who are newly elected MPs as well to balance those portfolios. Traditionally, rookie MPs tend to focus on the constituency, ground game, stakeholder relations in their own community to ensure that they're elected 4 years later, while, large portfolios like what I still call a mayor because I'm from Vancouver, but the newly appointed Minister Robertson is managing a major file that the Prime Minister has designated a lot of initiatives towards, from the building aspect to infrastructure, as LP mentioned, as well as a regional development agency, Pacific Can, under his portfolio. So that will be tough to manage, but perhaps his experience as mayor will help that, and other rookie MPs as well have been appointed to ministerial roles. So it'll be interesting to balance those portfolios and those responsibilities for them. But in general, this seems to be a bit more of a lean and mean cabinet. And the secretaries of state showed that they're working under specific ministers, and we'll see how it plays out. But in terms of major relationship building, it was good to see Minister Hodgson start right off by going to Calgary, working with the oil and gas community as well as the other energy resource communities to ensure that they're not forgotten and they're not left behind in this whole process. So the managing relationships is going to be a really important aspect for this new cabinet and the Prime Minister.
Side note, so how is the PM doing on the floor? I mean, he's never been in the chamber. He's never been in debate. I mean, he doesn't have Mr. Poilievre to go up against. But in your opinion, how is he doing? Sajjid.
I'm happy to comment on that. It's interesting to note that most people assume that it's harder to teach political tact and quote unquote the game of politics, especially in an arena where there's so many veterans. If Mr. Poilievre was still in the House, perhaps it would be more of a challenge for the Prime Minister to convey his message in the House. However, with Andrew Scheer, he seems to be much more confident. He seems to be having fun up there, which is quite interesting in the fact that he doesn't have that experience. So this is, of course, the honeymoon phase. We'll see what happens. However, he seems to be doing a good job in question period in conveying the government's messaging. It also helps that there's over 100 new MPs, both in government and opposition, that are able to echo both prime ministers and opposition messaging. So there is a bit of that deferral of responsibilities where he doesn't have to absorb all of the question period responsibilities. And, perhaps the last prime minister was too available in question period, attending every day and the media scrums, while this prime minister has instructed his cabinet to play it a little bit closer to the vest. If you don't have something smart to say, don't say it.
Perfect. Thank you. I wanted to switch gears, jumping into the speech from the throne. It's been a very busy few weeks since the election on April 28th. So the speech from the throne, King Charles delivered it. Some clear themes coming out of it: economic growth, housing, and a pledge to knock down interprovincial barriers by Canada Day. Thoughts on the speech, LP?
Yeah, a very positive speech for construction, in my opinion, right? And it keep going on that trend that we've seen over the past few months, where construction went from an afterthought to government to a key election issue and then a core, public policy in their early days. And now what we're seeing is actually putting money where their mouth is and saying, well, actually, a good chunk of the throne speech from the king himself was directed to construction, was directed to having major project becoming reality in Canada. It's about getting investment to really happen. It's about making sure that our workforce is there and ready to go. So a very positive message from Mark Carney, one that, has been a few weeks now already. We've seen trickle down in House legislation and business, now in committee work, now that the committee of the House are in place. And we'll talk about C2 and C5 later on, but already we are seeing some legislation come out of it. So very positive message. The question remains, and this is my own pet peeve: no budget in June 2025, probably relegated to the fall. This is too late. I wish we would have a budget before that. I understand why they decided to go this way politically, but it's a risky proposition. So we know their political agenda. Thanks for the speech. We know some of the legislation, but we still don't have the figure and the budget plan that goes with it.
Essentially, how are you going to pay for that?
Yeah.
Sajjid.
Yeah, what I'm hearing as well, that the budget may be actually deferred to the spring, and then a fall economic statement might be what comes out in the fall. And yeah, it's convenient for the government, less accountability, less ways to be able to be penetrated by media and opposition. However, I was quite pleased with the throne speech for the industry as well. I never thought in my lifetime I'd hear the monarch speak about federal government working with municipal governments to cut red tape and speak about GST, no GST on new builds. So the fact that you heard that from King Charles was remarkable, but it just showed that throughout the campaign, that was the messaging, and clearly that was delivered by the monarch in the throne speech. So the priorities are there, and it's up to the government to execute them. However, as LP mentioned, I'm unsure how that's going to happen without a clear financial roadmap on how to achieve this. From $4.3 billion dedicated to Ukraine yesterday to the G7 summit, we really need to find out what the difference between operational capital spending is going to look like for over the next year, because there already seems to be a lot of spending commitments, and perhaps Canadians may not be as pleased that it's international more than national.
It's interesting because, day-to-day life, our households, you budget every day on every paycheck, and that's how you live and survive, and you got to account for that spending. So to be running a country and not have a budget per se now or even into the fall, and if you're saying spring, will be very interesting. I think Canadians will definitely take note of that. I wanted to touch on the mandate letter as well, because mandate letters is what we were expecting originally in conversation. That's usually the part. Prime Minister Carney issued one mandate letter, and I feel like the prime minister is all about business. And I think when you said a leaner, meaner cabinet, it kind of lends itself to that. So how, I don't want to say not normal is this, but usually each minister does get a mandate letter MP. Am I wrong?
No, that's correct. It's untraditional to say the least. I personally like the idea, the message it sends to say, we are one team dedicated to a very short list of priorities instead of that long shopping list of many letters for each minister with very different priorities. On the flip side, a lot of people have been arguing against that, and I understand their perspective, saying that it doesn't leave a lot of clarity around the role of specific minister for something that is not construction related. And it's easy when we're the lucky ones elected, but if you are on the other side in the social community or elsewhere and you don't know what your minister is going to do, it's a bit of a challenge. And then the second concern is, of course, that there must be behind door discussion between these minister and the prime minister to say, well, I see the one mandate letter, but as your minister for families, as your minister for senior, what do I do? Like, what do you want me to do? So there's this whole idea of the secret, unwritten mandate letter in the back door that is a bit of a concern to many Canadians and advocacy group. But personally, I think the mandate is a good idea. It's a clear message. It's a very positive one for industries and businesses. So of course, I'm championing that. But I can understand both sides of the idea.
And we've actually talked about this leading up to today's conversation. There was a lot of focus on construction and a lot of in the mandate letter. Did you want to touch on that, or?
Yeah, I mean, if there's one thing we can give to Mark Carney's government is that they have been pretty stable in their messaging, right? Early in the election, they came out with strong announcement around major project, energy corridor, build, baby, build. That was like in the first couple of weeks. And that ended up in the platform, ended up in the post-election presser, in the mandate letter, in the cabinet. Like, they've been sticking to the idea, which is something that, I think Justin Trudeau did a lot of good thing as prime minister, but he tended to be going where the music was playing, not so much sticking to that idea the way Carney does. If you ask most Canadian, like, it's easy again for us to say it's all good because it's all about building and prosperity. But if you're asking Canadian that cares about other issues that might not be on the agenda, they'll say, why that sole focus? Why is it all about trade, the U.S. and building? What about what's happening, for example, in Israel or with Palestinian aids or whatnot, right? There is more to federal politics than the few priorities that they have. At the same time, the whole idea of this positioning is to say we need to make sure the economy sustain what's happening in the US, sustain what's happening in Canada and globally, so that we can build on that. So we can become a nation that can afford all these other social things we want on the sideline. And I think that's why premiers are so engaged, and we've seen this through the meeting they've had fairly recently.
Sometimes less is more. And I've actually seen some lengthy mandate letters in my past in government. So yes, switching gears here, I did want to talk about, we've seen the mandate letter. We've seen the thrones from the speech. We've also seen several meetings, including Prime Minister Carney meeting with the premiers recently in regards to the wish list when we're talking infrastructure projects. So I would like to quote Doug Ford, Ontario's premier, that was leaving the meeting. He was saying, "Love is in the air," and there seem to be all smiles all around for now. Which provinces do you think are likely going to get some traction on this? Do you know any big wish lists, can't even say it, that we should be focusing on, particularly for industry?
This is an interesting one. The relationship between Doug Ford and Mark Carney is fascinating and very unique, right? Even through the election, and it's suddenly since the victory, it's been very positive, which is quite atypical for a Ontario Conservative premier and a federal Liberal prime minister. But, it is a powerful alliance, and we see it right now with local investment in Ontario, and some policies are quite well aligned federally and provincially there. So that's very interesting to see that fit, and I think Ontario will come up ahead of that relationship and dynamic. On the flip side, Alberta is probably the opposite, right? The Premier of Alberta has been having a very firm stance against Mark Carney, of course, supportive of Pierre Poilievre, a very different way to deal with the U.S. dynamic as well, and I think that put them a bit in the corner now that Mark Carney, while a minority government, has a very strong mandate and support nationally. Now, to come back to your question about what should we look for, I think the name of the game is really interprovincial trade barrier. When the mandate letter in the speech from the throne mentioned that idea of we'll take down trade barrier by July 1st, it was like, nah, none of that's happening, right? The reality is things are moving along. Bill C5, which we'll talk about in a minute, is 2 billion won in a way, and labor mobility and trade barrier is a big part of that discussion. And to my great surprise, many premier are ready to work on this and they're willing to act. We have a bit of a wake-up call of what's happening in the US and a bit of an opportunity to seize the crisis to change things that should have been changed a long time ago in Canada. Now, is it going to be removing all trade barrier? Are we going to become a one economy? I wish, but I don't think that's realistic. A number of these barriers are there for a reason, for protectionism at the provincial level, and you can't necessarily go against all of them because smaller provinces don't necessarily want big business from Toronto to take over the entire market, but there's a balance between policies that are there for a good reason of economic growth locally, while we have a whole lot of policy that really doesn't make sense and just create red tape that is not necessary. And I think that's where the Canadian government, through Bill C5, will tackle things, and premiers in collaboration with them over the summer months, which should do pretty good work.
Well, and outside of Bill C5, we have been seeing premiers meeting. I think it was Saskatchewan and Ontario, an agreement of allowing workers to work at each province and recognizing their trades. So that would address the skilled labor shortage that we're seeing right across the country. So conversations are happening. I think that's key. It's good to see. Sajjid, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I want to echo the interesting relationship between Premier Ford and Prime Minister Carney, and it also attests to the fact that Prime Minister Carney is governing more like a traditional liberal. I think it's important to note how similar he's governing to former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. And from what I've been hearing, he is actively advising him as well. So perhaps if we're trying to, predict or sketch out a roadmap on this Prime Minister's initiatives and his future moves, it would be best for us to study what Chrétien did from 93 onwards. And it was also an important economic time during that era. We were minutes away from being investigated from the IMF. Our economy was worse than Italy's at that point. So in terms of external pressures and economic crises, there are some similarities. It's also interesting to note how Premier Ford has become a de facto ambassador for the Prime Minister in this internal trade barrier aspects. I watched that press conference with Premier Canoe and him. It looked like two lads sharing a beer on a podium. They had such a good relationship, and it just shows that, similar to our field, the politics there is about relationship building. They're not just in the political business, they're in the relationship building business. So that's why it was interesting to note that during the campaign, how vocally opposed, how much vocal opposition there was, to Mr. Poilievre from Premier Ford, so when they're supposed to be a similar ideological framework. Even during Prime Minister Trudeau's worst points, no premier openly went against him as much as Premier Ford did to Mr. Poilievre. So it's interesting to note that, you have to be a team player. And right now, Premier Ford is being one of the best team players to the point where he's engaging in individual internal trade deals with various provinces. Now, from all the press conferences I've been watching in English and French, the media is asking why is British Columbia not part of this? So there's clearly a power vacuum that Premier Eby is not stepping up to work with some of the other major provinces to engage in these deals, because at this point, Manitoba and Ontario are going to profit the most because right out of the gate, they established a strong presence and a strong relationship with each other, echoing the Prime Minister's sentiments while focusing on probably a decades-old issue. We've been hearing this forever. So if this gets solved, it will be a major win for the provinces for whenever their elections come up, as well as for the PM for the next federal election.
I think when you strip away the party colors as well, I think everyone at the end of the day wants one thing, and that is for the betterment of our country and a profitable country, and one where we can all live happily.
Yeah. One of the challenge, though, is this is a very, very timely issue. If you miss the boat on this, it won't come back again for a while. So if you're a provincial administration and you see value for your province and for your economy to have that kind of open relationship, don't wait a year. Because, the day that dynamic turns in the US, the day Canadians start thinking that affordability is now again the bigger issue, the desire for having these discussions will fade away pretty quick. So we need to seize the crisis when it happens.
The time is now, LP. All right, we've been touching on this throughout the conversation. Let's dive right into Bill C5. Some are calling it the most talked about infrastructure bill in decades. LP, can you break down what Bill C5 is all about and what it means for industry?
Bill C5 is a two-in-one, if you can put it this way. Many will say it's too big. It might be an omnibus, if you would want to call it this way, and many think it's going too fast through the House without sufficient consultation. And I think that, whether you like it or not, this is a good indication of the kind of administration Carney is running, right? Looking for result efficiently. What C5 is really all that discussion around interprovincial trade barrier, that one Canadian economy, as they tagged it, but also the Build Canada bill, the major project, the discussion about making sure we can build in Canada and put the foundation in place. And in between these two branches of C5, we have a number of initiatives that are put forward to the Parliament to accept and turn into law to make sure we can move forwards in these great projects and making sure our economy sustain the challenges we've seen in the past few years. In a way, I look at this as the legislation that summarized the challenge we face over the last few months of the Trump administration and the discussion of the campaign package in one. It's not the only bill in front of the House. C2 is an important one in terms of border security, specifically addressing some of the concern with the U.S. Again, a lot of very specific clauses around the impact on immigration process, the impact on cash transaction, for example. But between these two bills, what we can see is very clear direction going through Parliament to say this is what we're willing to move forward. Interesting on C5, I mentioned the pushback from a number of community, environmental group, indigenous groups saying there's not enough consultation, this is going too fast. Well, today, House Committee will be looking at this bill all the way to midnight, most likely, to be able to get this out of the door. Because again, federal parliament is not planned to be in session for all that much longer. So if they want to see these bill become law, they need to do it now.
So Bill C5 has been propped up by the Conservatives in the House. Is that helping to speed things along, Sajjid? What is the chances of this becoming a reality before Canada Day?
In terms of the fact the Conservatives are supporting it, that's great news for the government and good news for the industry. And for the most part, usually opposition is not so quick to support government's agenda and bills that are introduced in the House. However, this is clearly seen as Canadian interests rather than a Liberal government's interests. However, in British Columbia, Bill 15, and Ontario, their bill as well, to prioritize national projects. All the governments across the country are stuck between a rock and a hard place. I don't think I have seen more groups be vocally opposed to what Premier Eby and his government introduced in this bill. Now, perhaps the public is prioritizing consultation less because of the need to build these projects in the nation's interest and fast tracking them. However, it will be a tough communication and PR situation to manage for the years coming forward. I remember from the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, the BC Chamber of Commerce, among others, all opposing this bill. So it will be very tough for governments across the country to manage that moving forward. And frankly, the Trudeau government had this reputation, precedence of always prioritizing consultation. So the major flip clearly is alarming to many Indigenous communities and eco-justice groups, but it seems that the government's interests and the nation-building interests will be prioritized. In terms of whether it's going to happen by Canada Day, I think enough movement on this file is enough of a win. So if there's enough movement by Canada today, and the Prime Minister and this government can at least point to something that it's being achieved, that alone is a win. It was, of course, a bold date. However, it seems that the premiers will be more forgiving if they feel at least some progress was made.
And once the dust starts to settle a bit more in the future, obviously, we will come back and dissect the bill and dive into really, really what it means for industry moving forward. So, LP, I wanted to touch on, you were invited to a meeting with Prime Minister and other stakeholders recently. Big announcement in regarding defense spending.
Yeah, it was Monday last week, and that's a good one to discuss because we tend to hyper focus on bills in front of the house, right? Because these are tangible, written piece of documentation. But there's a lot of announcements that don't require laws necessarily. Good example is the executive branch, the government, deciding to respect effectively its NATO commitment to spend 2% of GDP in defense spending. The plan was to match that 2% in 5 years. The announcement was, well, actually, we'll do it this year and will sustain this going forward. So, in other words, a significant desire to invest in our armed forces, which was really well received by Canadian Army and different branches of the force, but also, of course, the defense community that sees some real challenges with our procurement in the armed forces, right? I can't remember the exact word. You'll find it in the clip, but the prime minister started his presentation by saying something along the line of only one of our submarine is seaworthy and only half of our helicopters can fly, or something of that nature, right? It really showcased just how bad of a state our equipment is in Canada because of decades, and it's not one color or the other, but really decades of misinvestment in defense. We have a role to play internationally in meeting these NATO targets, especially in a world where NATO is in a precarious situation right now because of what's happening in the US, but also because of all the geopolitical reality we see around the world. Ukraine and Russia is in a dire situation. What we've seen out of the G7 is good investment in that regard, but Canada has a role to play in bolstering our defense spending. Plays into this. The situation in the Middle East is also very concerning with what happened over the past few days between Israel and Iran. But the reality is, this showcased a couple important pivots. The first one, in my opinion, the reason why CC was invited is a strong desire to invest in defense infrastructure, right? It's a great way to say, we're going to invest on the defense spending, we're going to meet NATO commitment, but we will do that by creating Canadian job across Canada, wherever we have military installation and bases, including the North, and do this in a way that keeps capital asset in Canada, building our military base, airstrips and whatnot, port infrastructure, as opposed to acquiring vehicles, aircraft, ships, whatever, that often are manufactured abroad and quite often to the US. And I think this is the second part that was very important, the announcement saying we want to promote American manufacturing and our big partner around the world, not just the US. It's not just going to be Lockheed Martin providing us with more and more and sending that money to US. It's also working with our counterpart in Europe, for example. And we've seen just recently their desire to join forces in terms of defense with European nation, as we see a world that, in many decades haven't been that unstable in terms of European security.
I think it's important, and you did touch on this, as also, most people, when they hear defense spending, you're thinking helicopters and equipment. But for when it relates to industry, we're talking structures and bases and ports and such. And it's important to note that, yes, you're right, that does create jobs and it does have that direct impact on industry. So interesting to see that rolling out in the coming months and years as well. Sajjid, thoughts?
2% spending this year was a commitment to Canadian and international industry, as well as to Canadian international relations. I had the pleasure during my final year in university, my alma mater, SFU, to be a part of a program where we shadowed diplomats at NATO headquarters and then studied crisis management exercise at their college in Rome. And NATO officials commended Canadians for being able to work together, work with anyone. Our diversity is our strength. However, we were criticized for not maintaining our commitments or fulfilling our commitments when it came to 2% spending. This move is not just a sign to Canadians that we are here for their best interests in terms of defending our borders and defending our Arctic, but it was a commitment to the international community that we're people of our word, and that it was a big sign. It brings a lot of confidence, especially to the Americans. It was very difficult for them to work with us at times when they can just point to the fact, well, you're not contributing, you're not managing expectations, you're not managing your role and responsibilities to this international alliance that we were a founding member of in the 40s. So this is a major sign of confidence to the international community and to Canadians. And it's interesting to note that, defense spending in the past has been controversial, but when you look at polling after this announcement, the largest community that supported this was the Conservative community. We're Conservative Party members. Over 60% supported this because right now, when the world is so unstable, Canadians are valuing the fact that we have our own identity and we can defend ourselves, while we can also produce jobs and build in our own community instead of relying on the Boeings, Lockheed Martins, the Halliburtons, perhaps we can start investing more in the Canadian companies that are at the forefront of the defense industry, construction industry.
Showing the world that we can stand on our own 2 feet, essentially. So it has been a very busy, I call it bite-sized spring summer session. LP House of Commons is wrapping up this week. There's still a lot of topics that we haven't touched on. So let's do some rapid fire topic questions here. I did want to touch on polling numbers because I love to talk polls. LP, let's talk leadership numbers when it comes to where we're sitting now.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic where we just heard today from some pollster that Carney's approval has been climbing since the election, which is not typical. Certainly not the case for Donald Trump. Currently sitting at 67% approval rating, and I think that speaks to what Sajjid just mentioned, how many of his policy are firmly in the center of the electoral spectrum. He's really appealing to a lot of conservatives that were not fan of Trudeau because of some more left-leaning policies where, defense spending and infrastructure investment and red tape resonate with both these core liberal, but also a good segment of the Conservative Party. And then as a consequence of that, I assume what we see is challenge for Poilievre leadership. It's difficult to be Pierre Poilievre right now. First of all, you're not in the House. You're about to run for a seat that many Canadians feel is kind of strange. Like you lose your seat, you go take someone else. It's perfectly normal in politics. It happens fairly frequently, but it's still frowned upon by a lot of Canadians. And at the same time, you're not in the House. You're not present as much as the prime minister is. Meanwhile, Mark Carney is going everywhere, being a rock star, right? So this is difficult, even if you do everything right, to be the second guy, the other guy, right? Mm-hmm. And what we see is more and more rumbling and question from member of the caucus or the party saying, well, is this really the path forward? I don't think we'll see a change there. I think Pierre Poilievre will be elected in the by-election and will go back to the House and be the leader for the foreseeable future. But I think conservatives have good reason to ask themselves, is Pierre Poilievre the right person to go against Mark Carney in 2-3 years? This question remains to be tested.
So I do want to touch on that, Sajjid. The by-election is still up in the air when it will be, but also there is a leadership review coming up for Mr. Poilievre in January. So what is the latest word on by-election, and how will that all roll out in the coming months?
Well, yeah, it's up to the Prime Minister to decide the date. He has been very collegial in his messaging that he does want Mr. Poilievre back in the House. It's interesting to note that this is not the Conservative Party Canada necessarily in the Liberal Party Canada. It is Mark Carney's Liberals. And for the most part, it is still Pierre Poilievre's Liberals. His base supports him, perhaps not necessarily just the party. So when that leadership review happens in January and the internal council within the Conservatives perhaps test his leadership and perhaps a lack of confidence, he can just take it back to the membership and they'll overwhelmingly support him. So he still has that control and respect within his base and membership. However, if you notice, most of his social media were clips of him in question period. So that's taking a lot of his momentum away, and it's not building a strong rapport in media. And like LP said, all the Prime Minister has to do is travel, host summits like the G7, normalize relations with India. There's so much that bandwidth that's been taken up by major initiatives. And as long as the Americans continue to be as involved as they are in trade negotiations with us or threats, or as well as their role in the Middle East crises, the bandwidth of the media is going to continue to support that, and perhaps not a leader who is not in the House and doesn't have that momentum to build.
We've covered a lot of ground on this episode. Is there anything that I did not have on the list that we should be talking about, LP? I think we covered it all, no?
That's a good question. There's so much going on. There's so much. I think that covers the main thing. I think the U.S. dynamic is worth mentioning maybe in further detail, right? We've been through crazy time with our partner in the U.S. The tariff situation is easing. I think I can put it this way fairly nicely. The court ruling has been positive in that dynamic. I think now the U.S. is turning its attention to a lot of other issues. We've seen Donald Trump leave the G7 early to go allegedly deal with what's happening in Iran. We've seen the large fleet of tanker flying to Europe to being parked there for making sure the U.S. have plenty of military capacity if need be. We see in California civil unrest and tension around deportation and ICE raids. I think this is important as Canadian and as an industry for construction specifically, as a lot of our supply chain come from the US, to stay very attuned to what's happening in the US and how that will impact us as a country and as an industry. Because the US I've said that many times, I'll say it again, the US is going through societal change. It's not just politics. It's not just Trump. It's not just the White House. There's things happening within the American people where there's a sharp divide, and there's nowhere we can see more clearly than the people of California that stand up for their value and their right as a much more progressive state, and the value of many other American across many part of the U.S., usually red states, that have a different perspective. And Canada's not immune to that. We have that same kind of divide that we see and feel on many file, and Europe is in the same boat as well. We've seen it in Germany, we see it in the UK. The world is changing. I think we've been going through a pandemic. We're going through difficult economic time, affordable time, generational change, and as a result, our world is changing fast, and we need to pay attention to this.
All right, let's wrap things up on a positive note. One of the biggest and most well-known events, I would say, across the country, the Calgary Stampede is coming up. LP, you and Rod, the president of the CCA, will be in attendance. Are you going, Sajjid?
Unfortunately, I won't be there this year, but I know LP will be able to manage it and advocate for both of us.
We'll bring a big cutout of you guys, and no, but it's interesting to talk about Stampede, not just the event itself, but I think everything happening over the summer, right? You've mentioned the House of Commons is probably about to rise. We never know for sure, right? The calendar says end date is Friday this week. Could be done today. Probably not. It could be done next week if they decide to extend it to make sure some bill pass through. But it's very unlikely that they'll sit through the summer. It's probably not a good decision politically either. And this leads to this, what we call the barbecue season in politics, right? A chance for member of parliament to go back to their riding and meet with their chamber of commerce and their social club and whatnot, and really connect with constituents. And this will be especially important this year, as many of them are brand new MPs that don't really know their people all that much, and the prime minister need to go across the country and meet people. And Stampede is, in my opinion, a temple of that. This is, a 2-week festival in Calgary, Alberta, one of the most well-known country festival. But more importantly, it is a very intense political event. For at least the first week, quite often the 2 week entirely, there's reception after reception from every single organization you can think of, and lobby group and advocacy firm, but also provincial government from other province quite often show up to say, we'll attend our specific event at Stampede. So CCA, alongside with our partner association from across the country, and especially the Calgary Construction Association, will be happy to be engaged there and be present for the whole first week of Stampede, and be sure we connect with our national counterpart as well as our national government.
All right. Thank you both for taking the time today. I'm Craig Larkins, and this is the Builders Bench.